Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. How real is greedflation? Do women actually pay a pink tax for the same products as men? Do price controls help make things we need more affordable? These are the questions Ryan Bourne seeks to answer in his new book, The War on Prices. And today I'm excited to talk about price theory as the answer to these questions and many more with Ryan. Ryan is the R. Evan Scharf Chair of the Public Understanding of Economics at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on fiscal policy, inequality, minimum wages, infrastructure spending, the cost of living, and rent control. Welcome to Qualified Opinion, Ryan.
Great to be with you, Vera.
So before we start talking about the book, I want to kind of ask you a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about your career trajectory. How did you end up being an economist? How did you end up at the Cato Institute? You're from England. Tell us about you.
Well, I've actually been studying economics since I was 14. We had it as a high school option in the UK. So I studied it between 14 and 16. It really captured my imagination. Went on to study it as part of my kind of final 2 years at high school, and then went and studied an undergraduate degree in economics at Cambridge University. And then I graduated in the aftermath, or the very start, of the financial crisis. And at that stage, I was fully intending to follow all of my friends into the city of London and do some financial job, but all of those jobs dried up.
Make money.
Exactly. So I decided to stay on for another year at Cambridge and do the MPhil, the master's qualification in economics, which was really the kind of mathematical proofs behind everything that I'd already done. So I came out of college. I started working for an economic consultancy doing public policy work and competition policy work. And working on behalf of clients didn't really sit well with me. I thought a lot of the time we were kind of representing what they wanted us to say. We were doing some valuable work, but a lot of the time I thought we were kind of effectively lobbying for government subsidies for various programs. And then I had a lucky break, really. I broke my leg playing soccer. I was at home during the period of the 2010 general election. And there was a big kind of fiscal crisis in the UK at the time. I started blogging about the fiscal crisis and I started getting a bit of attention. I thought, is there a way that I could do this type of thing as a career and actually work in public policy? So I found the think tank world, and I've been working in that world for various organizations ever since. I started at the Centre for Policy Studies, which was a think tank founded by Margaret Thatcher in the UK. I went on to the Institute of Economic Affairs, and then 7 years ago, I came to Cato.
So 7 years ago. So you were there during the pandemic. So you wrote this book. Well, actually, you edited this book. It has actually a lot of very prestigious economists, and it really covers a lot of topic. The book is named The War on Prices. And at the time we're talking, the book isn't out yet. It's coming out on May 16th, right?
May 14th, yeah.
May 14th. Okay. And the content is really interesting. It's so there's the part one is about inflation, and it covers literally everything we've talked about in the last 3 years about inflation. The cause of inflation, it discussed the reason behind inflation, but it discussed also all the scapegoats effectively, or actually ask questions. The book is actually very polite and it doesn't talk about scapegoating. But you talk about all the different culprits that have been accused of causing inflation. And then you talk about, there's a part 2 on prices and price control, and then a part 3 on value. And why did you feel it was so important to write this book now?
Well, after inflation hit, we've just experienced the highest inflation rates since the early 1980s and prolonged inflation since the 1970s. So after that hit, what I was seeing in the media were a lot of misconceptions and confusions about what inflation was and what caused it. Ideas that we thought were buried in the 1970s. So we saw the confusion between relative price changes and inflation, the idea that one price going up causes inflation rather than inflation being a macroeconomic phenomenon. We saw the belief that kind of temporary supply shocks coming out of the pandemic and the Ukraine war caused all of the inflation. We saw the idea that workers' wage demands were causing inflation, and then a host of other kind of one-off factors. And as a result,
we heard about cost push inflation, which is, I thought that had been buried too.
Yeah, no. So all of these ideas that we heard in the 1970s seem to be returning. And as a result, I thought, well, there seems to be a large section of the population and the political class who think inflation really is a result of like malevolent actors or one-off shocks to the economy, rather than primarily being a story about monetary mismanagement. So I kind of started putting a book together that would address those themes. But as I started thinking about it, I realized that a lot of the fundamental economic errors, the failure to think through kind of basic supply and demand that applied to the inflation, were also the reason why we were seeing increasing levels of price controls at federal, state, and local level across other parts of the economy. And when I actually listed them out, already in many individual markets in the US, we see controls on rents, we see higher minimum wages, we see a lot of healthcare price controls and premium price controls, we see anti-price gouging laws, we've got now Joe Biden's war on junk fees. So ultimately, I thought we're actually living through a period where we've got this drumbeat for government regulation of prices, not just to counteract inflation, but to kind of help the poor, most often in individual markets as well. And I think that that's really dangerous. I think most economists are inherently kind of opposed to price controls. They not only generate inefficiency, but they tend to have lots of unintended consequences. And so I really wanted to put a book together that addressed these misconceptions about inflation and price controls head on. But then also, you mentioned the third section, also really got to the heart of a lot of the moral arguments we hear against market prices that underpin a lot of those policies.
So let's start there. Can you actually tell us? I think prices are beautiful. I think the fact that that prices vary, they go up and down. I think that value is absolutely overlooked and underrated. And it's more than this. It's like people don't understand the fundamental ethics, in a way, if I can say this, that exists behind prices. Can you make the case for us? What do prices do for us?
Yeah, so when most ordinary people think about prices, they just think as if everybody can just kind of set whatever price they please. But in essence, the beauty of market pricing, the key point to understand, is that what anybody can charge in a market at any given time is really disciplined by two big factors. Competition in the industry, or the threat that another entrepreneur or somebody is going to come forward and provide the good at a lower price, but also consumers' willingness and ability to pay for the product at the same time. So once you kind of understand that prices come from this intersection of people's willingness to pay and demand and people's willingness and suppliers' willingness to supply, price movements really provide signals of what we broadly want more of or want less of, indeed. So, a price.
So are you saying that price are this just phenomenal aggregators of knowledge? Yeah. I mean, basically they represent at all time and many, many, many markets, the value that people put not only on goods and services, but also reflect scarcity in the economy?
Yeah, they aggregate up a lot of our subjective valuations about different activities and help producers and consumers coordinate to supply or demand things according to real conditions in the economy, according to the relative scarcity of products. So, as you say, it's a key value here, why prices are so valuable as a coordination mechanism, is that they don't require us to go out and obtain lots of knowledge about what's going on in a market. If the price of baby formula goes up, as it did a couple of years ago, as an individual consumer, I don't need to go and study up on the fact that there's been some fire in a factory, or there's been some regulation that's been breached in a factory that means a factory is closed down and there's less baby formula in the market. I just see the higher price and think, wow, this is perhaps not as good a time to stock up on baby formula. I'll buy a bit less than I otherwise would have done and just take what I need right now. Likewise, other suppliers will see that higher price and they don't need to know what's going on in other factories. They just know now is a more profitable time for us to expand our production, run overtime, pay our workers, hire some new workers to meet this demand at the higher price. So prices enable us to coordinate activity in a decentralized way without requiring us to obtain lots of costly information about what's been going on.
And so when we understand kind of where price come from, then it makes a lot of misconception about prices and about companies in particular, like go away. So for instance, you address, let's talk about inflation. Can you give us some, you have a good recap in your book about all the misconception that took place, especially in 2021 and 2022 of the basically the way people were thinking about the rise in prices that they saw. What were people thinking?
I mean, so one of the big narratives that we've heard is that corporate greed or corporate profit puffing has actually caused inflation. And the basic idea comes down to people looking at what happened to prices and profits in 2021 and 2022 and seeing that they were both going up at the same time and thinking, well, companies decided to charge higher prices and they were able to obtain higher profits. Isn't it then the case that higher profits are in some way kind of causing higher prices? And shouldn't we collectively through government try to clamp down on this greed and keep products more affordable for people? Of course, that ignores a third factor that was perhaps driving both at the same time, which is the fact that at the start of the pandemic, the Federal Reserve had overseen a $6 trillion increase in the money supply, coupled with the fact that we'd seen expansive kind of government borrowing, which one would expect leads to money changing hands more quickly through the economy. So you combine those two factors. And actually what I think was driving inflation at that time was the fact we were seeing huge levels of new demand in the economy coming through increased spending. Now, why does that push up profits at the same time as prices? Well, for the simple fact that many producers have contracts with their workers. They only tend to adjust wages once per year, say. They have a lot of input contracts that last for a certain period of time. So retail prices tend to be a lot more flexible when you have periods of increased demand, unexpected increased demand, than the firm's cost base. So, in the short term, that leads to increased profits for many companies. And indeed, the profit share did go up in the economy at that time. But that was really reflective of the fact that we'd seen this unexpected inflation driven by excessive spending. And, there are certain companies that would have been aware of the fact that over time, we were living through a broadly inflationary environment. They knew that when their wage contracts were going to be renegotiated with their workers were going to demand higher pay. So some of them were getting ahead of the curve and increasing their retail prices first in the knowledge that their cost base was about to go up as well. So you combine all of those factors, and yes, there are good economic reasons why we would expect profits to go up at the same time as prices. That did not mean that profits were driving prices. It meant both profits and prices were being driven by that excess stimulus.
But, in 2021, I was actually kind of surprised about the utter confusion, even among economists who were confusing inflation, the phenomenon of all price, including wages going up, and relative prices changing. So 2021 was really the year after the first third of the year, people were talking about how there wasn't going to be any inflation, no inflation, no inflation. And then when it was clear that there was something happening, there was a lot of this is transitory, meaning this is the product of the constraint on the supply side due to supply chain constraints or limitations. But that never made any sense to me because that constraint, a supply shock effectively would mean change in relative prices. It wouldn't mean all prices going up. And we still heard this towards the end of 2021. Now, all the way until the summer, I would get it. I could get it. But by the end, it was very clear that it was more than a change in some prices. And so I was just surprised about this. And you have a section in your book about the misunderstanding between inflation and relative prices. And I think it's such an important, this is such a common misunderstanding that I would really like you to kind of talk about it.
Yeah. So when a lot of people experience inflation, they see it as an increase in particular prices in the economy. But it's crucial to understand that the macroeconomic phenomenon of inflation, which is what we're really trying to get at and trying to measure when we think about inflation, is really, in the medium term, all prices going up in the economy by an equivalent proportion. So that results from, a larger amount of money relative to production of goods and services, or likewise, fewer goods and services being produced for the same amount of money in circulation and being spent. You're absolutely right that initially, when inflation hit, a lot of people thought it was to do with supply problems in individual sectors. And I think some of that is forgivable to the extent that when you do have an unexpected inflation driven by too much spending, or in part by too much spending at that time, it can very much look as if this is problems in individual sectors. Now,
and there were supply side constraints.
There were supply side constraints, and then there was the gas price spike as a result of the Ukraine war. But why do I say that, one can look like the other? Well, if all of a sudden you have extensive new demand, people have more cash, they're going out and spending more. What happens is, in industries which are close to their capacity already, you hit constraints earlier. So all of a sudden, retailers run out of the product and they go back to the manufacturers and say, can you produce more? Quite often it takes some time for the manufacturers to respond to that extra demand. So it can look like the price is going up because there's a kind of manufacturing bottlenecks. But actually that just ignores the fact that the whole issue in the first place has been driven by that excess demand. So the kind of bottlenecks and supply problems are often a consequence of an unexpected inflation and not the explanation for why the inflation has come about.
Yeah. And the reverse is true. I mean, I always say, when I understand the confusion, like for instance, when the war in Ukraine started, the price of energy, which is present in a lot of things, went up quite dramatically, right? And that one price can actually drive up the measure of inflation. But what really matters in the end is relative to other prices. Are like all prices going up relative to wages. And that's where, in my opinion, you can really see the difference. In the fall of 2021, I remember Jack Salmon and I were looking back. We went and looked at entrance in ports, and it was restored to pre-pandemic levels, right? And the other thing that was actually quite stunning is like when you looked at the level of inflation that we faced in the US, and you looked at countries like, for instance, the Scandinavian countries that had done much, much less stimulus than we did. I mean, it's worth reminding people, like we did 27% of GDP, 29% of our GDP and the UK also did quite a bit, even compared to France, which was 10% of GDP. A lot of, Denmark was something like 4% of their GDP in form of stimulus. And they had much less. It was like there was 2.5% inflation. And I remember I kept sending emails saying, if really it's all about supply chain, aren't supply chains global? Right? And it was just striking to me that people didn't understand like that difference between an increase in relative prices versus inflation.
Yeah, no. So one qualification I'd give to this is that there are certain prices of goods and services, certain relative price changes that can actually reflect big supply shocks to the economy, which can temporarily increase the price.
Yes.
So certainly, if you have a huge international oil or gas price spike, as we saw when the Ukraine war began, In economic terms, we talk about it, that shrinks the production possibility frontier of the economy, right? Our ability to produce goods and services is impaired. So we have the same amount of money chasing fewer goods and services being produced. That can raise the price level across the economy. The really crucial thing, though, is that supply shocks like that don't tend to be particularly large in the macroeconomic scheme of things. They certainly can't explain the fact, that the price level in the US is still 12% over where it would have been had we carried on at our 2% target. And secondly, when that occurs, it tends to be really rapid, right? So we have a period where prices go up, but of course, because inflation is the rate of change in prices, after that price change has happened, inflation then drops back again very quickly. So I think a lot of the people who were saying that this was all transitory and, we've just got to ride out all of this stuff that's been happening in the pandemic and Ukraine war, were really overestimating the impact of supply shocks on the economy, first and foremost. But then they were proven to be wrong ultimately, because inflation endured much more broadly than they were expecting. But, we shouldn't deny that supply shocks can affect the price level, but they don't tend to affect inflation for very long, because inflation, by definition, is kind of a sustained increase in prices that ultimately manifests across the whole economy.
What about shrinkflation? That's another one that's like that we've heard talked about a lot. And interestingly, not at the time where it happened. It's really now, right? There was a lot of shrinkflation. Can you talk a little bit about this?
Yeah, so shrinkflation is the phenomenon where rather than raising package prices, producers decide to just reduce the amount of product in a package, but keep the package the same price. So in effect, the per unit price has gone up, but consumers might not notice it as obviously. And that really, in this context, is just a manifestation of inflation. Right? When you get a big increase in demand, a big rise in the general price level, firms have to decide how to adjust their prices. Sometimes they'll just increase the package price. Other times they'll increase the unit price by reducing the amount in the package. Now, this isn't a new phenomenon. Companies have been doing this explicitly since the late 1980s. And indeed, there was a big spike of them doing it in 2016. And the official inflation...
And it's legal, right?
It's perfectly legal. The official inflation statistics seek to account for it. And to the extent that their attempts to do so are accurate, they find that only roughly around 10% of the price increases we've seen for certain things like snacks and household paper products are actually driven by this product downsizing. Now, this is a perfectly reasonable way for companies to adjust to an inflationary environment. They have to judge what their consumers would want best, what will maintain their market share and their profitability. And for some, particularly serving low-income consumers, they may decide that not raising the package price, but reducing the amount of product in the packet is the profit-maximizing way of doing that. Now, Joe Biden, the president, seems to think that's inherently exploitative. And it may well be the case that consumers are less attuned to it than higher prices. But really, absent them doing that, absent shrinkflation, the most likely outcome was that they'd instead have raised their package prices further. So if anything, I've been saying the president should be grateful to these companies, because I think higher prices would have been more noticeable. And of course, high food price inflation is one of the things that voters really hate, and many of them blame the president for.
And shrinkflation is really the consequence of inflation.
Yeah, it's just a manifestation of inflation.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is like, it doesn't happen in every market, right? It tends to happen in a market where consumers are very sensitive to prices. So it's, in a way, the way I think about it is it's the way to still be able to buy your snacks, right? Sure, you get less of it, but at the very least, you're not kind of in a position to have to decide whether you're going to get the snack or not, because prices have gone up so much that you decide that you just can't buy that whole thing.
Yeah, I think it's very noticeable that this occurred. This phenomenon was mainly in 2022, but in snacks and household paper products, which tend to serve lower income consumers disproportionately. So I think, producers were sensitive to the fact that these consumers were very price sensitive. Now you've got a ridiculous spectacle in Congress of Senator Bob Casey trying to introduce legislation to ban shrinkflation. Now, aside from anything else, the idea that this could ever be binding as legislation, I mean, even however you write the legislation, producers could always just introduce a new product line and then eliminate an existing product line in time. The idea that this is policeable, let alone desirable, it's just really fanciful. It's just signaling.
I know. I totally agree with you, and I found that about this legislation only today. Can you actually let's even assume that they could enforce it, and somehow companies decide the threat of being sued for shrinkflation activity is too high. What do you think the consequence of such a legislation would be on prices and on consumers?
Well, if producers judge that they couldn't make profits running a product line by raising the package price because their consumers are too price sensitive, then they may just withdraw the product line entirely, which is for consumers who want that product is in effect an infinite price increase. So because they're no longer able to access the product. Now, in reality, I think producers would look to other ways to adjust. There are other margins that they can adjust on. So one concept that I've heard of quite recently, which I've never heard of before, is skimpflation, which is rather than reducing the amount of product in the packet, you perhaps put the product in a less desirable packet. You use less plastic, or you use smaller packaging or whatever. So I think there are lots of other margins that producers would kind of try to adjust, but we should always remember that they're in the business of trying to make profits, and they probably know far more about what their consumers want than some politician sitting in Congress.
And the business of making profit requires them to actually pay a lot of attention to their consumers, which is one of the things that seems to be forgotten in this whole thing.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right.
So it's a good time to shift and talk about price control. I mean, price control has been talked as a way to kind of stop inflation, but price control is used just so many places, right? And it's a big part of your book. It's like a third of the book. Can you tell us what are the main reasons why you think price control is such a very big deal?
Yeah, so I mean, where do you start? I mean, most price controls that we experience or think about are actually kind of price caps, where the government puts a legally mandated maximum price on a good or service, or says a price can only go up by a certain amount each year. Now, if that is successful in holding down the price below what would otherwise be the market price, the main issue is that it creates shortages of the product. A lower price makes the product more appealing to consumers, so you increase the quantity demanded of the product. But of course, the lower price makes it less profitable to serve the market, so you get less in the way of quantity supplied, and that difference is really manifests itself as shortages. Now that can mean longer queues for certain products. It can mean, in wartime, it often means rationing of certain products. But I think one of the really interesting things in the book that we've written about a lot is that, in reality, there are lots of other margins of adjustment, ways that businesses adjust to price caps, especially, that often aren't immediately obvious, but can also cause a lot of harm and inefficiency to consumers.
Yeah, you have a section in this, which is there are other costs to price control than shortages. You have an entire section on this.
Yeah, so one of the manifestations is that producers, suppliers can reduce the quality of their product. We see this with rent control legislation, for example. If you hold down the amount that a landlord can increase rents, one incentive is to let the state of the property fall to reflect the new value of the rent. So you don't do as much maintenance, upkeep, repair. You don't make investments to make the property as attractive. Some producers try to compensate for the fact that they're no longer able to charge the market price by using other fees and charges. And then no doubt the Biden administration comes along and calls those junk fees. You have to have alternative means of allocating the product quite often. So as I say, that can mean rationing, it can mean queuing, it can mean bureaucracy and favoritism. And, if you've got a willing buyer and a willing seller who are hell-bent on actually making a trade. You can have quite extensive black markets when you have, kind of the shadow economy grows when you have price controls. So they're the kind of main obvious costs. There are, of course, broader costs to this that quite often aren't accounted for, which is that price controls can cause broader discoordination in the economy. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you think about rent control, for example, you can have a situation where if you're one of the lucky people that's able to obtain a rent control property that's now in shorter supply because of that binding rent control, you don't want to give that up very easily. And it makes you less likely to move to a new job. It makes you less likely to move perhaps into a property which wouldn't be under rent control if you have a bigger family or your work situation changes. And so as a result of that, you can have a lot of people located in the wrong places or being unwilling to take jobs in which they'd be kind of more productive and perhaps would fulfill their lives more. So you can kind of get broader discoordination and downstream consequences from price controls that aren't always immediately obvious.
Yeah, and it's disheartening to see that there are a lot of cities, for instance, that still don't understand these issues, even though, I mean, they've been covered for a very, very, very long time, right? How do you explain this? Is this a special interest group? Who are the special interests behind maintenance of rent control, for instance?
Well, I think it can be politically appealing, particularly in cities in which you've had extensive regulatory constraints on new building through land use and zoning regulation. So, in effect, markets become really hot because you have rising demand as population goes up, as people's incomes go up. If supply is not kind of meeting that demand, once rents start going up pretty significantly to reflect that kind of long-term pressure, there can become a big rental constituency that appeals to policymakers to kind of step in. So, politicians are in the market for votes. And rent control is probably the most studied form of price control by economists. And the vast swathe of literature highlights some of the negative consequences I've outlined. In fact, we've had a couple of experiments relatively recently in 2021. The city of St. Paul capped rents at 3% per year in a really highly inflationary environment. And new multifamily building permits actually fell 80% immediately after that was entrenched. Now, how do we know that just wasn't a market downturn? Well, next door in Minneapolis, they'd actually gone up by 70%. No doubt some of that being displaced activity from St. Paul to Minneapolis. But so straight away,
natural experiments are the friends of economists.
Exactly, especially when you have two cities so close together like that. So straight away, the politicians then had to step in and change the ordinance to exempt new units, for example. There have been others in the past couple of decades. In 2020, Berlin froze rents and saw a huge, I think it was a 40% reduction in supply as people decided to sell for owner occupation or convert to forms of tenure that didn't fall under the rent control framework. So this is really well studied and well known, and the only kind of answer that I have for you really as to why places keep doing it is other political incentives. I mean, if you've got a constituency of renters that are a large part of the voting bloc in a city in which rents are going up pretty dramatically, they're very hot markets, I think it can be in politicians' perceived interest to engage in this type of price control.
Yeah, and I talked with Brian Kaplan about his new book on housing deregulation. And one of the things that he points to is precisely the fact that the damaging impact of housing regulation is precisely that it triggers different regulatory response as opposed to in order to fix a lot of the price increases triggered by the housing regulation. So you have a case of a wrong plus a wrong plus a wrong that's really definitely did not make a right. And it's just maddening. So let's talk now about gender, actually. So what about that pink tax that I hear talked about, where apparently women pay more taxes than men, right? Isn't that correct?
Well, I think this is a really...
Isn't there a discrimination against us ladies?
Well, there actually is a real pink tax, and that's tariffs. Tariffs are quite often differentially applied in terms of their rates, particularly for a lot of clothing, golf clothes, sports clothes, and they're higher for women than men. But that's not what we mean, or what economists write about when they're talking about the pink
Is this
tax.
because the demand is less elastic for women?
Well, no, these are government set tariffs. So that's the real pink tax. So this is a really interesting case study, and I think we should bear it in mind when we're hearing all these new fangled explanations for what's going on in pricing right now. So back in the 2010s, there was this idea floating around that market prices were sexist, right? It became conventional wisdom that companies were systematically charging more for the same products that were marketed to women rather than being marketed to men. And this really came about because Bill de Blasio's Department of Consumer Affairs, when he was mayor of New York City, did a study of 397 product pairs, where a company has something that's perceived to be a men's version and a women's version. And they found that on average, the women's versions tended to be 7% more expensive than the men's version. So that was, things like clothes, kids' toys, toiletries, healthcare products for seniors. And so the message of that paper was really very much companies are exploiting women. They're charging them higher markups on their goods, hence the pink tax, because quite often, these goods marketed to women were coloured in pink or, had different names or whatever. Now, as an economist, that perhaps doesn't make much sense, or never made much sense to me, because if those goods were fundamentally the same but just differently branded, and women themselves were genuinely indifferent between the versions, why wouldn't they just buy the men's versions?
Exactly.
It suggests to me that there must be something more meaningful, perhaps subtle but meaningful differences between the products. And now that we have some more economic analysis of this, that's exactly what we find, basically. So economists were actually commissioned by the FTC to look at what was going on in the personal care market. And they also found, yes, there appeared to be accrued pink tax. I think it was 15%, they said, when they compared products. But when you actually controlled for the ingredients, this was for personal care items, remember, when you actually controlled for the ingredients, so you were comparing like with like, that pink tax was almost entirely abolished. It was trivial sum remaining. And indeed, women's products were cheaper for items like body wash, shampoo, shaving cream. So the big difference was really essentially that the products being sold to women were different. And this wasn't because women were kind of more loyal towards certain brands. It wasn't because the women's versions were operating in sectors where they had more market power. Follow-up research has found that a lot of the goods that women seemed to prefer were just more expensive to produce. They had higher marginal costs of production and distribution. So, this isn't a case of sexist businesses. It was a case of a lot of free choices made by women when both versions were available to them to opt for stuff that was marketed to them that happened to cost more to produce.
The first time I heard about the pink tax, I thought, man, this is insulting. They really think we're just a bunch of idiots who just have these men products that are available just right there at cheaper price, but we can't see through it. And here we are being fooled by these greedy corporations who are charging. I thought the argument in and of itself was insulting to women, as if there's just a bunch of idiots. And that leads us to the pay gap, right? The price of labor. Also, it's an argument of not of comparing apple to oranges, right? I think it's Vanessa Brown-Calder, right, who wrote that section in the book, but it's a good follow-up. Can you talk to us a little bit about this? Is there a smoking gun? Is there discrimination in the price in the price paid between women and men? Are really women that much underpaid and still laboring to try to make it in the marketplace?
Well, there's so much you could say about this, but I think the key thing, so just to recap for your listeners, the gender pay gap is basically the idea that median weekly earnings for women working full-time are about 83% of men's across the whole, economy, that is. So people look at that and they often speak as if that's a result of discrimination by businesses, like businesses are paying women less than men for the same work. Now, that's actually not what the statistic shows. This is across the whole economy. So straight away, we have to account for the fact women tend to work in different industries on average. They tend to work on average, not all women, but on average, fewer hours and less likely to work in industries where they're on call or working weekends or working till 3 o'clock in the morning or whatever. And once you control for all of those types of factors, the gender pay gap then again tends to fall to relatively low levels. So some people respond to that and say, well, okay, but isn't this societal discrimination against women? Isn't this, just, it might not be the individual business, but there's more going on. And certainly it may well be the case that like social attitudes dictate women go into certain industries rather than others. We can't get at that as
no, because I mean there is a motherhood tax in a sense, which is that because the gap is easily explained by the fact that women usually are the primary caregiver for children, but also elderly parents and such. And so that's where you're saying, like, some people say, well, isn't there like a cultural basically problem there that women feel that they have to be that?
Yeah,
right?
That's exactly right. So women under 30 in cities like New York and DC, LA, I believe, actually earn more than men. So the gender pay gap, historically might have been exacerbated by different educational attainment between men and women, but that gap has kind of closed now. So really what we see driving the gap now, the primary thing is that women of childbearing age, so we say, tend to have lower earnings than men after childbirth. So why is that? Well, hours worked tend to go down. We tend to see a reduction in labour force participation. And crucially, what Claudia Goldin, who won the Nobel Prize for pointing some of this out, has shown is that women just after childbirth are less likely to do jobs where are client facing, where you need to be on call the whole time, working weekends. So whatever's driving it, priorities within families seem to change, and they seem to particularly affect women in a way that on average their pay relative to men drops quite significantly.
So effectively, the gap is driven by choices either made by women, but at the very least made in the context of a family. And Claudia Goldin has like a fascinating case study about pharmacists, because you get people of the same degree and pediatrician too, where basically like in jobs where you don't have to have, everyone has the same hours. It doesn't really matter when you do your hours, and you don't find in these type of industries a lot of a gap between men and women. And where you see the gaps are very often in professions like, for instance, a woman lawyer will prefer to be off counsel, where the hours are much more regular, than be a partner, where basically if you're in the middle of the case, you're going to have to be on. You could be disrupted no matter what time it is of the day, of the night, of weekends, right? Isn't that? Like,
yeah, no, that's exactly right. So in industries where you can kind of engineer flexibility that enables men and women to participate in the same way, there tends to be almost no gender pay gap at all. So you're exactly right. Pharmacies tend to be one of those industries. You tend to get like kind of partnerships where you get 2 or 3 people kind of working together, and the flexibility is kind of ingrained. So Goldin's point is that if we really want to close more of the gender pay gap as a society, we can say whether that should be an aim or not. It's really about individual businesses finding ways for men and women to work more flexibly. And, if there's a big demand for that, then employers will have to supply it. If lots of workers want that as a future, employers will have to supply it. But that seems to be the biggest gap at the moment, and where you see the deviation between pay rates for men and women.
I mean, we could talk about the book. I mean, it's just, I really recommend that everyone who is interested in any things price related and have kind of a comprehensive, it covers a lot of just misconception about the value of price moving up and down. And it's also very accessible. I was telling Brian before we started this interview that I was going to give it to my youngest daughter, because I actually think it'd be a great book for her. But I want to actually talk about why there is such a misunderstanding about the value of the flexibility of prices. What is it? I mean, is it a lack of economic education? I mean, after all, I mean, economists, we take this class, price theory, right? Chicago is well known for its price theory, but I mean, there's like economists, understand this. So is it a lack of economic education that explains this kind of like, I don't want to say that they're allergic to the people feel that there's something offensive about price going up, for instance.
Yeah, so I think it depends whether we're talking about the general public or economists. So I'll go through each of those. So with the general public, I think it's just very difficult for somebody not trained in economics at all to think about prices being the result of, I hesitate to use the word system, but like a bottom up forces of suppliers and buyers interacting within a market. A lot of the general public seem to think about prices as being set by an individual with monopoly market power. And as such, they, in many cases, consider a supplier putting up a price when demand has increased as capitalizing in a greedy way on a changed situation. So when they do that, they tend to ignore the fact that if you don't allocate by price when you have higher demand, you've got to allocate in some other way, whether that's queuing, rationing, or the like. And those ways not only generate kind of inefficiency, but in their own way, quite often lead to unfair outcomes. A dollar is a dollar, but as we saw with some of the vaccines when they were first available for COVID-19, in the absence of a kind of price mechanism, those who are kind of politically favoured, those with high incomes, can tend to get access to products before the general public. So that's kind of like the general population, I think. But
you have sorry to interrupt, but you have a really good chapter in there written by my colleague Leah Pagalishvili on the benefit of dynamic pricing, and this is an issue that comes up all the time in the case of Uber, right? Like, why do they price surging? People just don't understand why that's actually a good thing.
Yeah, no, that's totally right. And, we saw it quite recently when there was a suggestion that Wendy's might be engaging in some form of dynamic pricing. And Elizabeth Warren got really upset about that and almost implied that Congress should use its powers to restrict companies from engaging in dynamic pricing, which would have been pretty disastrous, given more companies are moving in that direction. But to go back to your original question, I'd love to think just economic education is the solution to this. But I think the truth is that economists themselves have been doing less price theory over time. So they're doing less in the way of studying how market economies address what is produced, how it's produced, and who gets what through analyzing prices. There are still some universities that teach this extensively. Of course, Chicago has Chicago price theory. But instead, I think a lot of the economics academy has shifted towards doing, on the one hand, a lot of deeply theoretical microeconomic work, which often focuses on trying to find and identify market failures. Joseph Stiglitz won a Nobel Prize in part for doing this type of work. But then at the same time, a host of like theory-light empirical work where people just think, well, we need to just let the data speak for itself. So kind of data without theory. And I think both of these trends are kind of really problematic, but they're probably problematic for different reasons. Just doing the theory of kind of market failures ignores the clear empirical evidence that people like Vernon Smith, whose experiments have shown that actually interactions within a market quite often lead to outcomes that look very much like competitive markets, even with a small number of buyers and sellers. So, focusing on these market failures without trying to quantify them, I think, is a problem. And quite often, doing empirical work without theory can be really misleading. And I wrote a piece on this recently where I talked about an example where Robert Minton and Casey Mulligan look at trends in wages over time. And there are scenarios where you could look at the wage changes over time of, say, barbers and farmers and conclude that, productivity changes have nothing to do with these, because wages in both sectors tend to go up by roughly the same amount, even though productivity is going up for farmers much more quickly than it is for barbers. But of course, that ignores the fact that those industries are interacting. And the only reason we still have people willing to be barbers is the fact that the price is bid up by people who would otherwise decide to be farmers. So if you just looked at that and did pure empirical evidence, you might conclude productivity has no impact on wages, when in fact the productivity improvements from farmers are driving higher wages for farmers and barbers at the same time. So both of these trends are problematic, and I just really wish that price theory was more of a core to how economics is taught at universities.
Why do you think even economists are moving away from price theory?
I think part of it is there is so much more data available these days, and people want innovative empirical work to kind of prove or disprove particular theories. Increasingly, economists are kind of headed towards studying quite niche subjects, but I think you can't really do good economics and good empirical work without a grounding in price theory and trying to understand the interaction between different markets and some of the perhaps unintended effects of certain regulations or price controls within a market setting. So, I think the incentives are there, given the widespread availability of data and given people want to be published with empirical work. I think those kind of take us away from price theory a bit. But I think it's really regretful for the kind of state of the discipline more broadly, because, as I say, I don't think you can really do good empirical work without understanding the theory of what we would expect to happen in a market context when you have something that's changing prices in some way.
And I agree. And I think it's worth noting that there's a big difference between the big data movement and even the modeling movement that we had. At the very least, when you had models, economists had to define and explain what were the parameters of their models, what were the assumptions underneath their model, what was the data selection about. When big data, it seems like it becomes kind of, you look at this massive data and you see a trend, the reason for it, without having necessarily a theory that holds you and grounds you down. And I just think that if this is where economics is going, economics is going to become a very insular and not that useful discipline. This is what worries me.
Yeah, and increasingly we're seeing kind of data driving people's understanding of theory as well. So, I know that we both follow the minimum wage literature quite closely, and I think everybody always cites the Carden-Kruger paper on fast food workers from the 90s, even though there's been tons of extensive empirical work since then. And they look at that result, which appeared to suggest that in that particular context, measuring things that way, an increase in the minimum wage led to more jobs, and then they extrapolate from that and say, well, there must be tons of monopsony power in the economy. And you're thinking, well, a fast food industry is highly competitive in most places. Yeah. And there's not much monopsony power over an employee, because an employee can't, a relatively low skilled employee doesn't just have to work at a fast food restaurant. It can work at any other kind of retailer in the economy or a whole bunch of different occupations. So, quite often people find an empirical result and then seek to explain that by appealing to a theory without thinking through the full implications of how that theory would manifest itself in other sectors.
Do you hope with this book to kind of actually revive an interest in price theory? Because certainly I was reading this and I was thinking, there's some of these chapters that I should know how to explain as well. And I don't know that I do anymore. And I was thinking, I should really spend a summer kind of taking the price theory course by Kevin Murphy at Chicago, like kind of, and at this point, it'd be more than a refresher. I think it'd be really kind of great for my brain. But at the same time, I do think that this is going to make people curious about price theory. And so is that some of what you had in mind, or am I kind of dreaming it?
No, I would like that to be the case. And actually, you can watch the whole of Kevin Murphy's price theory lectures on YouTube. So it's a kind of great resource and a great follow-up to the book. I'm mainly trying to highlight that I think at the moment, kind of almost unthinkingly, we're moving back to a world where governments are increasingly controlling prices. And even in areas where they're not controlling prices, there's kind of a drumbeat coming from below for them to control prices. And not just prices, but quite often kind of pricing structures. You know, the Biden administration is trying to mandate how airlines charge for their seat allocation practices, for example, trying to ban early termination fees for telecoms companies, you know, all sorts of very specific regulations on pricing structures.
Yeah, what they call junk fees for credit cards and banking. Yeah, I mean, all sorts of things. Do you think it's worse than it was 10 years ago? Or are you more sensitive to it right now just because we've had inflation and just we've seen the resurgence of so many kind of, call for price control in order to control inflation and such. So do you think it's really way worse?
I think we were seeing a growing use of price and wage controls at state level over the past decade. But I think this inflation has really exacerbated the trend to appeal to price controls. And in some ways, that's not surprising, right? We've seen a period where, food at home inflation, grocery price inflation, the price level in that has gone up by 21% in 3 years since Joe Biden became president. In the previous 11 years, it had only gone up by 18%. And voters are angry at that. They're angry at the fact that if you get a new mortgage, the average 30-year mortgage rate is 7.1%. These are both consequences of inflation. But the political incentives for both Biden and to a lesser extent central bankers are to explain this away by saying it's due to what businesses are doing, it's due to malevolent actors, Vladimir Putin, supply shocks, or everything else. So that kind of doesn't surprise me as much. But I think that type of thinking, this idea that prices and inflation are driven by these malevolent actors, lends itself to advocacy for price control. So it does not shock me that we've seen the anti-junk fees agenda, the push for anti-price gouging legislation at a federal level, and all of these other worries about shrinkflation and everything else, greedflation, come about because we've seen a big spike in the price level. Historically, that tends to be the ripe environment for price controls to be reintroduced.
So let me ask you one last question. What is the biggest misconception that you would want to address? Things that people understand the least or make the biggest mistake about when it comes to prices?
I think one of the themes that I realize push through almost all price controls and people's thinking about inflation is that ordinary members of the public seem to think it's just illegitimate for businesses to raise prices when there's increased demand as opposed to their costs going up. And I think it's crucial for us to understand that if you're going to cap prices or restrict prices, whether it's eliminating dynamic pricing, whether it's anti-price gouging legislation, whether it's saying companies can't raise prices in highly inflationary periods, then history shows that manifests itself as shortages, reductions in qualities of the product, and black markets. And I think we really need, to the extent that we need a public education campaign, it's to say that demand matters too when it comes to setting prices, not just supply.
Well, thank you so much, Ryan. So I really recommend The War on Prices. It's published by Cato, the Cato Institute, coming out on May 14th. And by the way, I also recommend Ryan's Substack of the same name, The War on Prices. So thanks so much, Ryan.
Thank you very much.